I'd like to welcome you to what I think is the 39th Agnes and Constantine Förster lecture on the immortality of the soul. Our speaker tonight is Jerome Y Lettvin. He's professor of bioengineering in the Department of Electrical Engineering and professor of communications physiology in the Department of Biology at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And he's probably the first engineer to speak in this series. Jerry was trained as a physician in 1943, and he's qualified as a neurologist and is still a practicing psychiatrist. I suppose he's best known professionally as a neurophysiologist, although he hates to admit it. He's made pioneering contributions in a number of areas, such as presynaptic inhibition in the spinal cord, neural codes for olfaction, the idea of multiple representation of information in neurons, and most recently he's been working in models of membrane excitability, and some of you may have heard his talk on that. I suppose his most famous contribution in neurophysiology was an article published in 1959 entitled "What the Frog's Eye Tells the Frog's Brain." And that article, I think, still stands today as the clearest explanation of how any sensory organ communicates information to the brain of any animal. But Jerry Lettvin is much more than a mere neurophysiologist. He's not only written poetry, but he's published it. He's written several articles on the natural origins of mythology. He's taught courses in the humanities department at MIT on subjects like the biological basis of perception and knowledge. As I recall, the sign on his door identifies the office beyond as the room occupied not by a neurobiologist, but by an experimental epistemologist. He's fondly remembered by us all for his televised debate with Timothy Leary on the evils of hallucinogenic drugs. And since that debate, few people have had the courage to engage him in public. But you have the opportunity tonight. In short, Jerry Lettvin has been working on the scientific and humanistic meaning of the human soul for 30 years. And I think he's well qualified to speak on the subject. So he will entertain us tonight with the title, Mortal Neurons, Immortal Monads.
While I realize that today is dedicated against smoking, I am state-bound to smoking while I think, and I cannot forego it for the amenities of public relations on a single day. Immortality of the soul is a fascinating topic since, by and large, as near as I can tell, the meaning of the term has changed considerably within the last century. Souls were considered immortal in a very different way in ancient times, certainly at least in the Greek tradition and in the church tradition which followed it. I suppose one thinks now of a persona or an ego going on ad infinitum ad nauseum, either in hell or in heaven, or something else of the sort, or an investiture of other animals by transmigration, things of this sort. But these are, in a sense, secondary to the principal meaning of the immortality of the soul as it was, I believe, originally laid out. The notion of the conservation or immortality of the soul begins with the Greeks in a unique way, and begins in a way which is not quite as it appears, not quite appearing in the same guise in other cultures. The Greeks were enamored or very much taken with the concept of automata, things which moved of themselves. As far back as one goes in the pre-Socratics, certainly up to the final, rather beautiful development in Democritus, all lost, and development in Aristotle, which we still retain, the notion of an automaton, that which moves of itself, is set off distinct and apart from things which are passively moved. If you will remember, one of the wonders of the ancient world was that theater of heroes, which ran by steam. It was the first self-moving thing made by man, powered internally. This self-movement was the sign of a kind of thing that was different from things which were moved passively. Early on, certainly Barnett tells us, in the pre-Socratic tradition, or at least certainly even well before that, the notion was had that there was a certain amount of soul in the world. And this soul, when it ceased to invest a man, would go elsewhere, but never by itself disappear. It's curious. You ask yourself, why is this the case? And it's not obvious. However, in the hands of Aristotle, on the one hand, Democritus on the other, but I cannot speak for Democritus as well, a reason is brought forth that is rather peculiar, but I think quite has to be taken seriously. And the reason is this: movement and change are one and the same. This much is gotten through all of the pre-Socratics. Whatever moves, whatever changes, these are considered very much the same breath. If I'm going to have a device or have an automaton, something which moves of itself, and I know that things which are moved by me usually are passive. For example, I throw a ball, I roll something across the floor, I shove it, and it comes to a stop. The notion that I, or a dog, or an ant, are made up of passively moving parts, one of which moves the other, like billiard balls colliding, in the end is self-defeating. It does not explain why I, sitting, suddenly get up from rest and begin to move around, or why a dog lying down suddenly gets up from rest and begins to move around. The notion, therefore, was that there was a substance, something else besides parts which were passively moved, that invested an automaton, something which moved of itself. And that, except as one wanted to enter into all sorts of paradoxes, had to have the quality of not being moved and not changing, so as to be in nature different from the parts which move and change under the impetus of whatever is central as a cause in the automaton. Aristotle takes it to the limit in talking about the unmoved mover, or the unchanged changer, which sits, as it were, in the center of I shouldn't say in the center, certainly sits as the motive force, or motive center, motive principle behind whatever moves of itself, say the whole universe. Now, it's an interesting thing to postulate an unchanged changer. The idea is that a substance which is not going to be of the same nature as that which is moved passively does not change, therefore cannot come into being and go out of being, as simple as that. Namely, by definition, the thing is not susceptible, or rather the substance is not susceptible of the sort of changes that we talk about with respect to those things that we can measure and shove about in the world. It's very tempting to go what the development was from Aristotle through the Stoics, Epicureans, up to the time of Origen, and then from then into Christology and theology, but the general notion laid out by Aristotle and competitive with the notion laid out by Democritus was quite clear. I may say that Aristotle, in an amusing way, worrying about how the unchanged changer can possibly change things without itself changing, has to postulate the first movement, which partakes in part of the nature of the unmoved mover and part of that which is moved, and later on in the hands of Origen becomes Christ, with the nature divine on the one hand and the nature mortal on the other. But the unmoved mover, the unchanged changer, remains a fundamental thing in Aristotle that would be a delight to discuss, except that this is not what I'm here for. I would much rather actually go into the history of this thing, this topic, than simply skim it in this rather crude way. Nevertheless, the notion of substance, and a conserved substance by virtue of the fact that it cannot change by definition, becomes the first immortal thing talked about. Immortal in the sense that by definition, since it cannot change, it can neither come into being or go out of being. Now that has nothing at all to do with our notions of immortality of the soul. But that is the basic initial mechanical logical story advanced by Aristotle and then taken to a kind of limit in later Christology and theology. This notion of a principal substance, an animate affair, a principle other than that which arises by mechanics, as being involved in things which moved of themselves, went on for quite a long time. God himself was the central unmoved mover, shall we say, the fundamental substance, the sole substance of the universe. And later on, when, for example, Newton talks about the world as, or the space as the sensorium of God, there are references in this to notions which have arisen before in the theology of the church. Now, the difficulty, you see, that one has with postulating a substance of this sort is that one can never, as it were, look at it, touch it, move it, change, do something to it so as to know it is there. For even as it were, to reach out and touch it is to change it, all right? Certainly to change it in our perceptions. It becomes a very abstract entity. Later on, of course, such people as Hume, the whole Lockean tradition, tried to read it out of existence as being an unnecessary object in philosophy. But substance remains more and more firmly embedded in Western theology for some 13 to 14 centuries. It comes to a kind of culmination in a philosopher not usually talked about. And it is from him that I prefer to start making my comments, leading in to the notions of Leibniz, and from Leibniz to modern neurology. There was a philosopher by the name of John of Scott, Erigena, who in Borges's epigram said God does not know what he is because he's not a what. That is, it was the first time that a grammatical expedient had been used to lay out the notion of what substance is. The notion of John of Scott was that God was the subject of all propositions, and the world was the set of predicates in these propositions. And God could not himself be a predicate in any proposition. He was the permanent subject. The notion existence lay in the notion of being the permanent subject of all propositions. The notion of reality was that which applied to the predicates. So that God as substance exists the world that he thinks is real, and there's no obvious contradiction between these things. The idea was to get away from the infinite regress arguments into which one gets when one starts talking about an all-powerful, all-knowing, etc. being. John of Scott was bitterly against saying anything at all about God. One simply said there was a substance, this was an act of faith, and the world was what he thought up. This rather charming notion, in a single move, removes questions about the nature of existence, the nature of substance, nature of reality, and so forth, by saying this all reduces to a convention or a notation for being able to handle some ordinarily very difficult to handle notions. As in any other form of thinking, mathematics or physics, notation becomes one of the most fundamental things that one can deal with until there is a language for handling what you want to talk about. You can only sit and impotently wave your hands. So one must not sneer at advances in notation, even notation in theology. For later on, in the 17th century, the great breakthrough made by Galileo is to substitute the notion of man in place of God, homo in loco Dei, and to postulate himself as the sole substance necessary to do physics. Imagine to yourself the situation confronting Galileo. One could imagine a ball impassioned by desire, worried about its relatives, refusing to fall. And supposing that one could think of a ball as an automaton with an internal principle, to that extent, one could never develop a physics or a set of laws by which balls fall. It is necessary to do physics to drain the world observed by the physicists of any internal principle whatsoever, leaving only external principles or external actions by which one part acts upon another, but no internal principles whatsoever. And so Galileo posits that he, as observer, is the sole source of all the qualities that one wants to talk about in the world. The world, he's willing to concede, somewhat reluctantly, consists at most of magnitudes, figures, and motions, and he's not entirely clear what he would mean even by that. But on the other hand, he's quite clear that in accounting for his own percepts and the qualities that he himself sees, he can lay down the laws in his model of the universe as God lays down the laws in his model of the universe. And this, of course, is the fundamental lesson to be learned from Galileo. From that point on, the world is never the same. It's interesting that the church never catches up on that point. They are not actually opposed to it, in point of fact. Galileo, by retreating to the old ignorabimus and ignoramus, you see, etc., about the external world, has taken on the curious solipsism that invests 17th century physics. He, as the sole author of all qualities, the sole perceiver of all qualities, can now invent to his heart's content that set of laws that carries perceived motions into other motions, perceived changes into other changes, perceived objects through the transformations that they undergo. And he takes full advantage of this. That is not to say that he denies the external world in any trivial, sort of silly sense, like, oh, come on, how do I know it's not a dream? That sort of thing. It's not that. It is merely that in order to do the work necessary for physics, it is required to cut out exactly that domain that you propose to deal with, and exclude everything else. There's no way one can make a theory of the whole world at once. A theory of anything is difficult to make. You lay out the realm of discourse and say, beyond this I will not go, before this I will not go, this is excluded once and for all, and now I will lay out the rules. Now, this attitude on the part of Galileo leads to this curious business now of the soul, Galileo's soul, or if you wish, Galileo himself, in some peculiar sense, being of the nature of God, that is immortal in terms of the process of making physics, although perfectly mortal in his parts. And this, of course, is a very peculiar sort of a picture to deal with. I'm not going to go, although I would much like to, into a generalized discourse on Galileo and his methods, or to go through the intervening philosophers, for example, Descartes, for example, Spinoza, on the way to Leibniz. But clearly, the codical ergo sum of Descartes is not uttered in any, shall we say, trivial sense. It is a statement that existence inheres in the thinking and in nothing else. It is not that I, as thinker, can deny you existence as if somehow or other this were a mode of controversy, as if existence were something like goodness or a Boy Scout badge to be worn upon one's lapel. When I say I exist, it's not an arrogance on my part saying none of you. No, it's the only thing that I can say to begin with if I'm going to do physics. I must start with a simple assertion, allowing me to lay out those propositions that will permit me to develop a science. It is a notational advantage. It is not a deep philosophical notion, it's a notational advantage. All right? So that the solipsism of the 17th century is not the logically belabored solipsism that the British are so happy to belabor, Russell, for example, and so forth. It's not that sort of thing at all. It's a very different kind of affair. Now, here is Galileo, Descartes, Spinoza, and so forth, concerned to lay out the notion of themselves as substance and that which they observe as to be dealt with in the same propositional sense that God deals with the world. And of course, this is the revolution in 17th century physics. But along with it comes a very serious point. Once you say that I will exclude, as is the case till today in quantum physics, I exclude the observer from the system. The observer is not something that can be brought in with the system. There's no way of talking about all of that at once. If I exclude the observer as Galileo wants and so forth, I'm perfectly capable of accounting for the world in the physics, providing that observer stays out. He is the substance. He's the excluded substance. And yet you are faced now with the question, what is the nature of a man, of a beast, of a thing, of a machine, such that by uttering the cogito in this curious way, and then going about putting together the laws to account for the qualities it sees, the observations it makes, what is there about it that permits this to happen? Now, it's clear that since you have excluded the observer from physics, from the physical consideration, you cannot now, having dropped him, bring him back in by some excuse. There's no way. And you're now faced by the curious required miracle of substance to be able to maintain the continued doing of physics. All right? Leibniz comes onto the scene at this point. I'm sorry, I know that I speak badly. I'm not a professional philosopher. I'm trying to give, as it were, an impressionistic view, and rather than go verbum et literatum, I'm sort of giving a broad painting, a caricature of the system. Leibniz comes onto the scene, and Leibniz is profoundly concerned not only with developing physics, but with developing a science of the observer as well. He, more than Descartes, more than any other person of the 17th century, is honestly concerned with a science of the observer, not simply with uttering a few casual reminders that he is there as substance, and we pay all homage to him, whether of God or whether Galileo or whether myself. The reason he is concerned with this is that Leibniz is the first man to conceive the modern computer and the possible advances of it. Leibniz, in fact, goes back to the naive Greek notion of anything which moves of itself, being an automata, with an internal principle for motion. And he decides to write a general theory of automata in such a way that one can not only encompass the physics on the one hand, but some knowledge of the observer on the other. At this point, let me shift. I know that you are anxiously waiting for me to get to the neurons. But the neurons are mortal things. They can wait. They'll die off in the course of the lecture. We'll get to them, you know. Come on. Leibniz, looking at the question of automata, sees a serious problem, and he sees it because he has gone one step further than the automatic computation available at his time, which was simply an adding machine. He reduces logic, at least the logic that he had, shows that you can reduce all logic to arithmetic. He does so before Boole does it. He then shows that all arithmetic can be done on a binary scale. In fact, binary mode. In fact, there's a charming story told of him that when the Jesuits brought back the king from China, he warned the Pope against handling with the Chinese, for they had a binary system already and were therefore significantly advanced over the rest of the world. He was very much taken with the binary system, and he saw that it would be possible to do a mechanical logic. When he said in the future, when philosophers disagree, they will not argue, they will say, let us sit down and compute. He meant exactly that. He foresaw building a logical machine, and he spent a considerable private fortune on so doing. He hired up optics people, mechanics and brass. But remember, the notion of the self-powered system was not available then. That is, the tapping of power in the elegant way that we do, you know, B plus and B minus supplies, an electronic device, you know, that was not available then. Not even an hydraulic source in the general sense was available. Just general notion of clockwork was endemic. And so he spent his fortune to no avail, but this, of course, did not inhibit him from thinking. And supposing that in the end one could produce such a machine that would be capable of dealing with complex matters on a philosophical basis even, he decides that he is going to look into the nature of machines such as to characterize their process independent of their mechanism. This is something that I'm going to go into in slightly more depth in a moment. He raises the question in paragraph 17 of the Monadology, suppose I were to build something that walked and talked like a man, and build it so large as a mill that I could open a door, walk into it, and see one gear moving on another. And I were to say, where is this loving of the man? Where is this notion that the man is talking about? In which gear does it lie in movement? And I should not be able to say it. He says, it cannot therefore be that in the motions of the gears or the mechanism, the notions which are being expressed by this homunculus, this large homunculoid, that the notions expressed by it lie in the motions of the parts. This, of course, obsessed him. And he was curious, if I cannot attribute the action of the machine to the machine itself, or describe the internal principle of the machine in terms of the mechanical actions, what is the language which is appropriate to this? Now, let me at this point remark that this is the introduction to the concept of the monad as the simple substance. A substance is an element of process as opposed to a thing or a part that is an element of mechanism. A substance is a point of view, as he says so explicitly in the Monadology. Now, before I go on to the simple substance, let me deal with a terribly complex substance to show you what is meant. He gives only two faculties, properties, by which one talks about a monad. For clearly, one monad can be distinct from another and therefore must be distinct by some properties. He talks of a monad as having perception, namely, and I quote him, the passing state. He also talks about a monad as having an appetition, which is that which changes the state from one state to another. In a word, he talks in rather modern terms about a state of the monad and state transitions of the monads as being the state being the perception, the rules for the state transition being the appetition. Let's see what he means by this. There was a science fiction story once written rather well, in which people, aged as I am, are put into a kind of a coffin-like affair, flayed alive as it were, and all nerve endings attached to a machine, so that into my optic nerve and olfactory nerve would come just such stimuli as would produce the same effect as were I to be smelling or seeing something. And in exactly the same way, every one of my motor nerves would be attached to the machine in such a way as to alter what I see in accord with the movement that I presume to have made. And of course, the story ends with me getting up on a horse, then riding off, in the best Western movie style tradition, feeling very young, very vigorous, and with the gun at my side, the perpetual gun at my side. Now, the notion of a world machine attached to me, so given by its own internal rules, by which the output of the motor nerves feed back to the input of the sensory nerves, so that I propose not to look at you and turn to look at that. And indeed, this is the way it seems to me. I will have activated my neck muscles, my eye muscles, and I have a world machine. In the full sense of the first and second little notions written down by Descartes, you understand. I would not be able to tell, is there a real world, or is there a world machine attached to it? And for Leibniz, the notion that I even would be curious about such a thing metaphysically, from the point of view of process, is an idle notion. Namely, the only things we want to talk about are the states and the state transitions and the laws of the state transitions. So you have perception leading to appetition, appetition changing the perception. The rules by which perception goes into appetition are the internal rules of the monad, And the rules by which application affects perception is, if you want to say, the external or unknown copula of this loop. It's a very interesting concept, you see. Because if you use this notion, there is no such thing as talking about an external world, an internal world, an I, a you, a me. I can only talk about myself, what I see, and the rules for transitions. Namely, I'm going to build another instrument like myself, and I want to know how to do it. This, at least, is what Leibniz was after with the monadology. So that when he talks about the monads having states and state transitions, he means exactly this. Now, it's perfectly clear that if the most that any monad can do is have perception and application, there are no windows to other monads at all. There are no other monads in the system. There's only one substance. All right? For each monad, there's only one substance itself. And the intriguing thing is, you see, that if you want to be generous, you can suppose that there are other monads. And if so, they must work by the same rules. And you suppose a plenum of such monads. And you now consider what happens as a result of that plenum. I'll come back to that in a little while. Please remind me to do so. Now, this image, vague as it is, peculiar as it is, sets about a completely new style of thinking, but one which is utterly misunderstood from that point on. Leibniz unashamedly takes his notion of substance, like Galileo does, from the theological background provided him by the church. Leibniz, at the same time, because of his particular thought concerned with computers, computational machinery, and so forth, is much concerned with what is the essential thing in an observer. He is going to make a science that applies to the observer. Doesn't succeed, of course. He simply lays out the metaphysics for the science. All right, now, let me break off for a moment. I would come back to my beloved Leibniz in a little while. But let me break off for a moment to talk about a neuron. Now, I've all been waiting, because neurons, what can be more modern? Neurons, Scientific American considers neurons of great importance. They devote a whole issue to a neuron. Must be something there. Let me give you the anatomical picture of a neuron, and we will see what can be said about them. A neuron can be considered to consist of three parts. There is a receiving part, there is an axon, and there is a distributing part. There happens to be a cell body lying here, there, or yonder, attached to one piece or another. It can be attached to the axon, to the receiving part, the distributing part. Doesn't really matter. This is the fundamental business in the system. There is a receiving part, which can be a sensillum that is affected by the external world, say, sensitive to light or touch, or smell, or what have you. Or else it can be the central nervous system and consists of a large tree, as if one had uprooted an elm, you see, and looked at the leafy arc. Here is the trunk of the tree, the axon. And lasted on to every available bit of surface of this leafy arc are hundreds of thousands and millions of synapses. An important word, you must synapses, which come from other neurons of provenance all over the nervous system. There are synapses from cells close by, synapses from distant cells. There are millions and millions of them. No two cells really saying the same thing. And all of them plastered onto this, in so dense a way that were you to dissolve the neuron away, the mosaic of synapses left would define the neuron completely. Now, from this morass, this receiving part, in the complex sense, proceeds a single axon, a simple tube, along which the impulse of the neuron goes. Now, the impulse does not begin here in this huge dendritic receiving part, this huge arbor. It begins in the axon and sometimes invades backward, but it begins here and sweeps down to invade a second tree, very much like a root system, whose branches are also multifarious. 2 to the 15th branches attributable sometimes to a single neuron. 2 to the 15th is not a trivial number. And in fact, if you take one of Scheibel's pictures from down in Los Angeles about the distribution of a single dorsal root fiber up and down the spinal cord, there are branches, whole leafy big branches, full of all sorts of minute branches, given off every segment of the spinal cord in a bewildering array. And here we have, therefore, this distributing part going hither, thither, and yon everywhere. I won't go into the electrical functions here, except to remark that what happens is that the axon, for some reason, excited or governed or inhibited or whatever, by the synapses which end on the receiving part, the axon will fire off. And fire off with a pulse interval which is in some curious way resonant with the distribution and magnitude of the state of the arbor at any time. Let me show you what is meant. But before I show you what's meant, the impulse comes down to this distributing tree and invades it. But it is not as if it spreads the good news everywhere like a television set. For no two impulses invade the same branches of the same arbor. Since the terminal branches of these arbors are a 10th micron diameter and can barely tolerate 10 impulses per second, and most frequently one will find axons firing off at moderately high frequencies, there's no way but what only one subset after another of the terminals fires a curiously noisy procedure. I'm not going to belabor you with the fundamental reasons or notions behind this, or the advantages to be gotten for it, but to remark that the thing is not the telephone system by a long shot. From the electrical point of view, the axon can be considered a nonlinear oscillator, a blocking oscillator, by which I mean nothing more nor less than a flush toilet. It has a nonlinear forcing function, a nonlinear restoring function, and a period of time until it can go off again. All right? And to the degree that it can, I could drive it fast or slow, depending upon the resonances of the system to which it is attached. For example, to which a toilet is attached. Somebody else is turning on faucets elsewhere, toilet fills up slowly, all that sort of business. In point of fact, every one of the synapses that ends upon this peculiar region, the receiving part, is capable either of exciting, that is producing a slight tendency toward increased firing, or inhibiting. They are shunts either to a voltage much higher than the resting voltage of the membrane, or shunts to a voltage lower, and all sorts of electrical phenomena occur, but not simple addition. Not simple addition because in this receiving part, in spite of the fact that all of the synapses are covered everywhere, there still remains a faint hint of the same nonlinearity that invests the axon. You will get amplifications. Now, all of this is gobbledygook to you, so let me give you the direct and clear image of what I'm talking about. Suppose I have a beginner playing a flute, and he has pressed down, covered some holes, open eyes, and he blows into the flute. and hear the most awful garbage coming out. A caterwauling which warbles up and down, in curious intervals through the scale. From an informational standpoint, I have a great deal of information by the caterwauling, exactly which holes are coming. All right? Namely, the intervals, the musical intervals through which he goes, tells me which holes are coming. A person who's really expert on the flute gives me very little information about which holes are coming while he plays, because he is that expert in control. Well, in point of fact, you can say that depending upon which synapses are active and which are inactive, I am badly fingering, or rather the axon is badly fingering the flute of its dendrites, all right? And gives the information out in terms of pulse intervals in exactly the same way a bad flute player gives out intervals, telling you roughly what the state of the dendritic system is. But that state is dependent upon millions and millions of terminals. Coming from where? Coming from everywhere. The terminals of this thing, that is the terminals of the distributing part, going where? Going everywhere. Going everywhere. What do I mean by that? I mean that if I take any two neurons in a nervous system, I can find a legitimate pathway that goes through those two, a complete circuit back to the neuron. The neuron, in fact, has, more or less in its view, every other neuron in the nervous system. And every other neuron is a hell of a lot. Furthermore, and this is the horrible thing, it has in its view the whole external world. Talking as a physicist, mind you. Suppose, for example, I hold up a finger and look at my finger. I've connected the neurons going to the muscles in my fingers to the neurons in my eye in exactly the same way that they are connected synaptically. The loops through my nervous system are only a small set of the loops. The loops traverse the whole external world. And indeed, I can say for a neuron, any neuron in my body, that it constitutes a point of view within me of everything that is possible to have a point of view from my point of me. Indeed, every one of the neurons in my nervous system, by virtue of its connectivity, indulges in a, shall we say, permits a description that can best be described only as a state, a transformation of the state to an appetition in the output which changes the state, and there's nothing else you can say about it. Not a blessed thing you can say about it. Let us observe what happens if you try to say something more about it. Suppose, and forgive me the caricature, really, please forgive it to me. But suppose in the distant Ural Mountains, and I really must give it my caricature, there sits a distant relative of mine by the name of Akahievich, straight out of Gogol, whose sole purpose it is to get the Nobel Prize by one means or another. He goes to look in the brain of a man for the mother neurons. There are neurons that embody the idea of mother. We will suppose there's a neuron that can embody an idea. The modern notions, the punk-fake notions, the notions the brain is a gland, and other disgusting notions of this, brought out by Catholic biochemists. But let's take it seriously. Here is a Akahievich who has decided that there will be mother neurons. And going through man after man for the distant neurons, there's no American Medical Association, no NIH telling you who you can work on, understand. And he has found, in fact, that there are 18 50,000 or something neurons connected with the notion of mother. Having put all these charts together, he's about ready to journey to Stockholm when he goes all the staggers Portnoy with a complaint, the familiar complaint. And at this point, Kahir cannot help but say, Portnoy, you're the proof of everything I want. Lie down on the table, let me help you. And he goes in with his magic microelectrodes, and he coagulates all 18,000 separate mother cells. And now we have to invent for ourselves an interview with Portnoy. Portnoy, you remember your mother? Huh? Here's the prize within your hands. Then you say, Portnoy, you remember your father? Father's not. Sure, I remember father. Who's your father married? Marriage is not a mother. No, it's an interesting point. Remember the red dress that walked around the house? Yeah, who wore it? Interesting point. Remember the boots you came last night? Who put them? Interesting point, you know. And all of a sudden realize mother is not such a thing as can be embodied in cells. A mother is a set of relations. And a relations to absolutely everything. As is any other word which is specific. As is any other word that you propose to reify the language. All right? There is no such thing as a place of loving. A place of this, a place of that. There is not that sort of a thing. There is the general connectivity of every part to every other, such that one cannot imagine, as it were, lesions of this sort occurring. Okay? These neurons, therefore, these mortal neurons are the mechanisms whereby a process is realized. And the process, the monad, not embodied, but attached, not attached to, connected, no, associated with the neuron. That process is immortal. Why is it immortal? Because it ain't part of the mechanism. It is a set of propositions which can be uttered quite independent of the time or the place about operations on things. All right? A process is something you intend to do something, you propose to do it, that's, how you propose to do it is the process. The mechanism are the synapses popping around, doing all of the goodies that they're doing, and the neuron can die. If the neuron dies, the process may not be realized there, but there still exists the process. All right? What Leibniz was stating that given from the language standpoint, given from the notion of how one goes about building things, there are two aspects. There is what you want to do, that's process. And there's how you're going to do it, which is mechanism. Process is immortal. It is not that which is realized by the particular mechanism, and only that. It transcends it. The mechanism is not the process. I can think about the process without the mechanism. The mechanism stops working. I don't have the process in that mechanism, but that doesn't mean that the process is dead. The mechanism is. Oddly enough, this is what Leibniz means by immortality. It is an immortality of exactly the same kind that our friend John of Scott was talking about with respect to God. Transcends, you see, the mechanism he's produced. The world as process sits in his head. Again, let me go into it. Is there a time and a place for the process? How can it? Time and place are as it were, within the substance of process. The process utters the time and place. The process carries, if you wish, the coordinate system into a world. You want to call it a world? Let's call it a state. Carries that in its model that it makes. But there's no time and place for a process. The process is not something we talk about in time. It's not something we talk about as place or having place. It is independent, it is given purely propositionally, and has nothing at all to do, specifically, nothing at all to do with the nature of mechanism as mechanism. Now, I've just been terribly obscure for a few minutes, making sounds as if I knew what I was talking about. Let me show you what is meant by this. Let us take an ordinary wristwatch and consider first a description of the wristwatch in terms of the operation of the gear. We talk about the mainspring and the storage of energy. We talk about one gear moving on another, and we always give the mechanical laws by which anything moves anything else. In the end, we end up with a complete description of the wristwatch. But there's nothing to tell us where to look, what to look for, because those are all intentional affairs, a different realm of discourse. Here I have a complete physical description of a watch, but no reason to look at any one part rather than another, no set of rules by which to look at the hands, no set of rules by which to tell, or anything else. Someone says, what can I use such a gadget for? I say, to illustrate the laws of motion. What can I use it for? I can use it as a hammer to knock a thumbtack into the board. There are indefinitely many processes attachable to the same mechanism, depending on how it was looked at. So here's the mechanism of no human process. I have unpacked the wristwatch. There are two parts to the manual that come with it. One is the principles of action. The other is directions for use. Principles of action is the mechanism. Directions for use is the process. Now, suppose I say the wristwatch is to tell time. How do you tell time? Look at the hands, see where the little hand is pointing to, see where the big hand is pointing to. I teach somebody how to use a wristwatch. Now, mind you, that statement about how to use a watch to tell time is process. Any number of mechanisms could have realized it. For any mechanism, there are many processes. For any process, there are many mechanisms. This many relationship forbids any unique time of one to the other. To the extent that I talk about an intention in my having a notion about process, I intend to tell time. I import the telling of time, as it were, in the process. Not the mechanism. The mechanism doesn't tell time. I tell the time by looking at the mechanism. Right? Or some other instrument that I build tells in some degree the time by looking at what's happening there. But the time is not in the mechanism. All right? And the time that I tell, what is the time that you tell the time? You can see yourself, it's become a little bit silly. What is the time of telling the time? Where's the place that you tell the time? And all of a sudden you begin to see, there is somewhat shaky. Leibniz takes the fundamental business of saying, look, we are going to suppose that space is somehow or another the order of the state instantaneously, and time is the order of state transitions. He says this explicitly in the monadology. All right? So that we expect that time and space are in this process called the monad, which is attached to the neuron. Attached to the neuron. At the end of the introduction to his volume, New Essays Concerning Human Understanding, his answer to Locke, Leibniz says that all automata are incorporeal. For them to be realized, there must be a corporeal mechanism. The automaton is always somehow or another associated with a mechanism, but is neither in the mechanism nor part of the mechanism. And he doesn't understand why people cannot understand this. All right? That is, for him, the process was something utterly divorced from the mechanism, and he wanted a theory or a metaphysics of process, which I am very badly stating here, because I'm not practiced in giving lectures in philosophy, and I don't quite know how to put it in correct modern terms. I'm trying to give you the spirit of what lay behind it. To a great extent, this has informed my own ideas about neurology. I do not now go about asking where in the brain is an idea, or what synapses connected up means that I have pleasure from something or another. You know, this to me strikes me as vulgar and beneath contempt. It's the sort of thing that no philosopher could possibly take seriously. Yet it lies within the empirics of current neurology. In point of fact, when you think about current neurology or neurophysiology and look at it seriously, you realize that you would much rather have the metaphysics of the ancients and immortal souls than the material nonsense which presently occurs. For let me show you what exists. Let us suppose that we have called in 3 neurophysiologists, types, to fix a television set which is one. The first type, or if you look at the television set and tell you how television set works, that's the thing. The first type says it's very simple. He unplugs the transistor, the picture vanishes, he says. That's the picture center of the television. Now, you know yourself that there is a certain absurdity about saying something. I could unplug the wall. See, that's the picture center. But you see, I unplugged the transistor because it's one little part. That's the center. Now, at this point, you know, you can start playing games. You unplug another transistor, put the first one back. The picture squeezes down the lower left-hand corner. You see, this is the lower left-hand corner concentrated portion of the picture. Now, so much you can get by ablation. That is to say, if you want to suppose that faculties, properties, qualities, and so forth can adhere in a place, you can end up with absurdities like that. As if plucking out my right eye and you say, see, that's a center of binocular vision where you don't have binocular vision. Now, this kind of thing is silly. But you permit it among neurologists or neurophysiologists because attached are so many names of nuclei you've never heard of that God knows the truth must be with them. Suppose we take a second one. Instead of doing any such crude affair, the second type of neurophysiologist comes in to look at our set. And we'll assume that in modern sense, you're going to have a digital transmission system for television. And so he plugs in his microelectrode, almost flat in the white probe, and his oscilloscope next to him, you see, and looking for all the world, you see. How should he put it? Only the good can see the tips of the electrodes. Like the Emperor's electrode. Yeah. So he puts this fine tip in, here, there, and yonder, and finally locates a place where the pulse go along the moment when Kojak is on the screen. And you suddenly get the, he announces to you, I have a great correlation with Kojak. It must be part. Mind you, I don't think he wants to say it to the epistemological when he says he was great subtlety. But it must be concerned somehow or another with the seeing of Kojak. Great publishers. Now, it's fairly obvious that you can go from now to doomsday doing this sort of thing on an ordinary television set and get as many results as you want. Correlations with as many empirics as you want. indefinitely and even make a major industry of it. And that heritage has been financed. The third type comes in and says, wait, says he, neither one of these are proofs of everything. I will come in and I will shock particular private television systems. Lightning bolt generator, he produces a shock. You see a twiddling picture there, a glob light there. And he says, what else is cogent? With an arrangement of twiddles and globs. If I associate these correctly, I can give you, in fact, a cogent. Now, you know, at this point, the absurdity is so manifest that you laugh. Why don't you laugh when the Scientific American brings out this sort of crap? You see, somebody comes out with a statement, there are these drugs, these receptors, the endorphins, this, that. You know, the pain of a man lies in your endorphins. In the absence of endorphins. Doesn't matter. No. But be a theist, it doesn't really matter, just as long as you assert something. But think for a moment of a pain center or a set of cells involved in pain. That same friend of mine, Kahievich, my distant cousin, in an earlier, less solid phase, was interested in the pain center brains of animals. And he finally follows the pain center, and one day he staggers into his office, a cat, completely bemired, you know, scratched, hurting like hell. He quickly afterwards removes the pain center, the cat scampers merrily away, and he puts the pain center in a dish and stimulates it, till the SPCA comes to shoot the dish out. It's incredible you to laugh. For either the pain was in that center, in which case the stimulation of it really was producing pain, or you did not have the pain center, there was something behind the center being, make up your minds. But don't read the crap. You see? In the end, the nervous system must force us back to a reevaluation, not necessarily along the lines I have so poorly sketched for you tonight, but along lines more like the classical metaphysics that is now permissible in this empirical era. Forces us back to reconsider the questions that we want answered by looking at a nervous system. I propose that the way in all through the 20th century questions have been proposed about nervous function are a vast folly. That the last people who proposed any interesting questions late in the 19th century died off with Helmholtz. That indeed nobody else since has proposed reasonable questions. For every one of them can be taken into an absurdity. It is interesting that maybe in the end that no questions can be answered by neurophysiology, as indeed I suspect. That the only way you will in fact be able to learn anything about a man is by building a man, not by analyzing it. And here I think I can bring into account the present business with computers. And I will go back to the mortality of computers versus the immortality of programs, if you want. All right? Let's take the present notion of a normal, modern computer system. And let's suppose a single man has been responsible for the setting up of the hardware, the software, all of the ancillary affairs by which you can in fact go in and solve problems. You go to the inventor of the system and you say to him, tell me what state the system is in as it's going through such a stage of computation. And he will look at you and say, you're insane. I cannot possibly tell. So you built it. Can't you tell me what to do? No. There's time sharing, there's hash code, there's random access. There are all of these things to make, as it were, the efficiency of the system work well. How the hell can I possibly tell you what's going on? Well, but you built it, don't you know? No. I know the rules I built in by which it worked. Those rules are immortal. But how the goddamn thing is now at this state, I cannot tell you. Now, if for so primitive a thing as a contemporary computer, its designer, which I don't put with a capital D, its inventor, where I don't use a capital I, tells you, I cannot tell you what state it's in, or what state sequence it's going through. At this point, you must pay strong attention. The system works by virtue not of analytic rules or notions of analyticity, but by a synthetic. By the act of creation, I have made rules by which the system works. These rules are independent to a large extent, in some of the systems, to a certain extent dependent upon the system. These are the rules by which computation is done. These are the immortals. All right? The machine itself, that's immortal. The hell will build it up. All right? The same thing, I think, we do or ought to do in neurology. We ought to start looking, as it were, at the immortal rules and not the mortal neurons.
If you have a cup that isn't used as an ashtray, you can have some water and then answer some questions.
Excuse me for being so diffuse. I have found that a diffuse lecture painting a vague, quantitative picture of what I'm talking about is sometimes a hell of a lot better than being exact, clear, and defined. I suppose I could have done it another way. It would have been more than that. Yes, please.
It seems rhetorically that you proceeded from a very well-grounded irony to a hyperbole, which implied that analysis is eventually insufficient as a means to approach
Always insufficient.
the soul.
That's right. Analysis is insufficient as a means to approach any process.
Well, in a way, rhetorically, looking at the development of thought rhetorically, how you would use this very well-grounded irony to arrive at that, what I might call a hyperbole, saying that
Let's even go further, ellipsis. We can make it a whole set of comic sections.
We appreciate the combinatorial complexity of the problem and the factual and ridiculous approaches that are all we have available now. But is it not possible to still conceive of some more complex analysis as being a means of approaching it?
I think I can put it, and I suppose better as an act of faith than as an act of logic, that if God himself were to come down with a huge book saying, this is the secret of how the nervous system works, I would not open it, for I would suspect him of being a demiurge. I'm not entirely sure that I believe the notion of how a nervous system works has any meaning. Right? Certainly, in the case of this multi-connectedness that I talked about, you see in here the hints of the principle of sufficient reason, which is going out without end on every little detail. Let me show you what is meant. I told you that there are millions of synapses ending in power. That a neuron responds only every now and so often. Is it responding to a generalized vote? Is it that there are some synapses who have no voice? No, because you can show by standard proofs, quite standard proofs in ordinary signal noise theory, that if in the uttermost tip of the most attenuated dendrite Extending the vastest distance from the cell, there sits solitarily one weak synapse, which occasionally produces a burp. Yet, you can always correlate, given enough material between measuring that burp and measuring what the cell does, you can correlate a relation. And you now imagine doing this for all the millions. And now you have millions of neurons. You see, the trouble is this. It may be that someone can say, oh, well, look, in the end, it's a finite state machine. You mustn't say anything about knockabout. From all practical points of view, knowing anything about this system analytically is absurd. Okay? Now, it's not that I'm saying it's absurd in principle. Who am I to utter in principle? See, in principle, a mathematician can utter. In principle, some lucky philosophers can utter. All I can say is it's unimaginable at present for me. Furthermore, I have a suspicion that the way the questions are couched, there's no way around them. Now, I admit that if I were saying such a thing as, I have to admit, you see, the disease of liking Leibniz and uttering sad things about the nervous system is endemic in the field. There was a man by the name of Jerome. Please allow me to say so as part of the answer. With Jerome, we used to go on a Berlin lecture circuit, uttering a famous lecture in which he said about the nervous system, having done regular work in it, ignoramus et ignorabimus. We don't know and we won't know. And so incensed was the great mathematician Hilbert by this, that he caused to be inscribed on his tombstone, Permissivism und Relativism. We must know and we will know. But you don't have to know in the categories by which the question is asked. That is, if a question is asked and it's clearly intractable, you find another way of asking. What I'm suggesting is that there may be more value in looking at rules for composition than in effects on the system to be had by analysis. That's all I'm saying. Namely, it might be better to guess how to build a system than how to analyze such a system. And the reason is that even in the analysis of a three-diode system, a simple thing, it is almost intractable by strict analysis. And the moment you come to even more complex systems, you come, particularly if they're interconnected, we come into the intractability much resembling, the sort of thing, the interaction, the many-body problem taken in the naked form. All right? This way, there is no statistical mechanics to rescue you, because you're not talking about mechanics. You're talking about information handling, and you don't know what statistics of this means. All I'm suggesting is that you should start paying attention to possibly confecting rather than analyzing as probably the kind of science that Leibniz had in mind. That is,
reminded us of discussing the plenum of the monads.
oh, the plenum, yes, I forgot to mention that. People have made a great deal of joke about Leibniz's treatment of universal harmony and so on. But if you take a look at the monads, what you see is that he had invented in one swell swoop, a century ahead of time, the concept of the integral transform. And the integral transform, not in the linear case, but the most general case. Every monad is a witness to absolutely everything. The more monads you have, the more resolved the witnessing becomes. And his statement, this is the best of all possible worlds, was a misquote. He is talking about a universal harmony, which is the miracle that each of these separate monads, not connected as it were, not seeing into each other, nevertheless attests to the same world from different points of view. All right? And the world becomes more resolved. It is as if you were to have diaries of wandering Jews at the end of time. The more wandering Jews, the more descriptions you can give of the world. Okay? The more fine description of the world. In a word, if you were to take such a thing as a linear integral transform, look, for example, at a photograph made by a standard linear transform. And you look at a single dot in the photograph and you say, why are you white or black? And the answer is, I'm white or black because of the whole picture. So you go to the next one and say, why are you white or black? I'm white or black because of the whole picture. And some are white and some are black, all right, of these little dots in the second photograph. Each one because of a different point of view on the whole picture. And the miracle is that the more dots you have, the more resolved your reconstruction of the original picture can be. Now, that's essentially what was meant by Leibniz, by the best of all possible worlds. And to him, the notion of a connected system of this sort that has higher and higher resolution, you see, is in fact a kind of a notion to which I would, in some other lecture, like to address in detail. Yes.
Could you relate your distinction between mechanisms and process to current psychiatric arguments about whether instincts are more valid than meanings, or whether meanings are the only thing that are important and instincts don't exist, or on the third hand, is everything to be explained in terms of medical model psychiatry with no feelings whatsoever? I think the third one you pretty well ruled out already.
Laura, you see, when you ask a question like that, you're embarrassed. By and large, I would say that if you talk to the dead in the light, you'll get it. Right? And if you're doing psychiatry, you talk an interesting language of psychiatry. The more distinctions it makes, the better. They are not aware that any system of psychiatry is particular or even plausible. So supposing that such a one would come about, I don't see any reason to suppose that this language has to be one thing or another. There's no exclusivity. On that level, I'm almost an existentialist. It's perfectly clear I'm talking very loosely here about processing. I'm perfectly willing to talk loosely about any subject. If it works, it's in the heat. If it doesn't work, throw it away. But at least look sometimes at what it is.
Do you think intelligence could be explained as an ability of efficiency of these algorithms, of these processes? And that by understanding these algorithms, you could increase...
You're trying to make fun of me, sure.
No, I'm just curious.
I don't know what is meant by intelligence. I don't know what means explaining intelligence. You see, the difficulty is this. If we take the view, as sometimes I feel one takes only when we start talking German. You see, for example, in German psychiatry, there is das S, das Wesen with capital W. You saw it. Capital letters, a real substantive. Now, the difficulty is when you take and reify abstract or vague notions, sometimes, we tend to say, trying to be more scientific than the physicists, gee, how can we measure? Well, there are things that are really not susceptible to measure speed. For example, no percent is susceptible to measure theory. All percents are absolutes. There's nothing to compare against. I look at your face. It's not that I recognize your face by comparing it with the faces around. There's an absolute quantity. His shirt is red, or there's some red. Not by virtue of the fact that I'm comparing it to the standard red, which somehow or another I covertly have. It's red! Red is part of the thing that shirt, you see. It has an absolute quantity. We do not have a science that allows one to deal in absolutes. All of modern science is based on measured data, which means everything has to be known. When we address mind and things of this sort, we're talking about absolutes. And for absolutes, there are no measures. When someone says, let's be precise about intelligence, let's measure intelligence, etc., I retreat in the utmost form. I'm perfectly willing to say that if you're running a business and you propose to exclude this type of person, other type of person, you can always find a test to do so. But that's business, and I'm not interested in that. If you're asking me seriously how one goes about measuring or giving account for or explaining intelligence of scientific, no, I don't know what is meant by that. I haven't made this idea of how to approach things. As you can see, I stumbled through the elements prior to any serious question that anyone can ask. Right?
Yes. Is your present point of view a repudiation of the kind of work that went into the frog's eye, frog's brain?
When someone quotes that work, I like to refer him back to a careful reading of it, not in the light of the nonsense that was later made into people talking about randomness. We were concerned with the question, and only the question, could one approach such notions as an indication of an a priori, a biological a priori, built into a system? That was all that we were addressing. In fact, those are the terminal sentences of that thing. The notion that you have to deal with the nervous system in terms of a language more alive to what you suppose perception was like in some big way, rather than what some physicist wanted to tell you perception had to be a kind of a corrupt version of, was in fact a fundamental engagement. I refuse to admit a physicist coming to me and saying, you will see that light as red because it's red light. Newton himself in the optics says that only the vulgar would make an error of saying light is red. Red is a quality. I can say light is rubefacient in that it makes me see red. But the light is not red. This is Newton in the optics. And it's an apology too. Now, this sort of a wish that the system, if one is going to read anything like hints of ways of going about making a procedure, right, is going to give you qualities almost as if the frog were talking. What's a fundamental idea if you have what you do? Right? Vastly different from the mishmash that was made into. And while I'm delighted at the public relations, I'm appalled at the means.
I think we can take one more short answer question.
Yes.
There's something about it. Is that you are saying, or rather, Leibniz said that monads are relations, processes.
Monads are substances in which you can only talk about states and rules for state transitions.
I know that. Okay. You have a new system, new mechanism that has not existed before, that can come to life somewhere, that has certain new relations. Okay? You have a new monad. And you can go on and on. Okay, a new process that has not existed before. A new relation, because the system is new. And you can go on, isn't it right?
No. Let's suppose that I have built a device that writes out for me time is, time was, time shall, time will be, just as the Brown said, the brass head did for Roger Bacon. Right? Now, the fact that I built a device and it has uttered these statements can lie in, let's take a look at those statements. Are those statements bound in time to curious way? Suppose I tell you the story now. Roger Bacon built a head which said time is, time will be, time was, and exploded. You say that's interesting. All of this, I'm telling you now, it's not now thing, I'm telling you about a current day. But suppose before that time Aristophanes, foreseeing the nonsense that was going to occur, says in the future there'll be a schmuck by the name of Roger Bacon who will zoom ahead that says, my name is Mamuzi Kawa. Now at this point, you will notice that the process, the saying of the head, and so forth, while you can subscript it to a particular event, as a process is relatively independent of that event, as is any other set of propositions. That is, in a weird way, what Leibniz tried to say is that while I can make contingent propositions that for their truth value are dependent upon the time and place of utterance, the propositions are really timeless, as any other propositions are. And I'm also spaceless in the sense that it doesn't matter whether you printed it this way, or printed it with large letters, or whatever. If you say, I built a device to give me a new set of functions, a new process, never thought about it. From the moment that you claim that it just thought about it, it's also permanent from that point on. And from that point backward into time, so you can always find things like it before, and maybe even it before. There is no such a thing as a new time or a new process.
And that is not really an integral calculus, because the integral over whatever of 0 is 0. That means that...
Oh, no.
Oh,
I can lay out any language I want. Make it follow, make certain elements follow certain rules, and say this is the given and play. And calculus is such a given. I'm not going to say that there's a deep metaphysical meaning to the fact that I can do the calculus, or that you can do the calculus, or that everything is 0 because it doesn't matter whether the calculus was done now in the 17th century. I'm not trying to be a nihilist in that sense. I'm simply saying that in the technique of approaching a system capable of exhibiting, shall we say, process, there are two ways of approaching. One is to account for the mechanism, and the second to account for the process. And the process is a difficult thing to talk about because we don't have a language for it. It's given in terms of intentions. What do you intend to do? And we know that in modern science, the one thing you must never talk about is intention. It must be given in terms of percepts. What is it you want to see? And everything in modern science must be independent of who sees it, or whether it's seen or not. Right? So that we are talking about something which is a retreat, literally, which requires a retreat, literally, to an old-fashioned idealist metaphysics that I have done more disservice to by talking about than I should have done. But I cannot see any escape from something like it. That doesn't mean I'm going to throw out all modern science, or to throw out the hard-won facts that neurophysiologists get. I'm simply saying there is an alternative view to such a system. I would like to see some explanation of it. I find it improbable in this empiricist age that there will be any. And in fact, I can barely talk about it in modern criticism. And that's all I said, nothing more than that. It was a confession of weakness. Don't hold me to logical consequences, because there's not a logical argument.